Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Rachel Johnston. I'm the BWC TTA Program Manager. Our next session is about body-worn cameras in correctional settings. I'm now happy to turn the session over to Dr. Chip Coldren.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Have to say, I think I about have that little speech memorized by now, as I think most of us do. But thank you very much for your shepherding of this entire conference. So welcome everyone to our session on body-worn cameras in correctional settings. While we can surmise, I think, that body-worn camera implementation issues and technology issues are similar across law enforcement and corrections, it is also probably safe to say that there are differences in these areas and maybe in some other areas, such as policy, video release, and maybe even digital evidence management. So in today's session, we'll look at some of these issues with two of our subject matter experts and with representatives from two departments of corrections, District of Columbia and New Jersey. From our technical assistance team, we have with us today, Ali Cuevas and Jeff Smith. Ali retired as Assistant Chief in the Camden County, New Jersey Police Department in 2016 after 25 years of service. He went on to serve as Director of the Police Academy at Camden County College, and he has been on our body-worn camera technical assistance team since 2016. Jeff Smith recently retired as Public Safety Director in Sturgis, Michigan after 7 years in that position, after 25 years in policing and 10 years in firefighting on his part. He and Ali have both been extremely valuable members of our technical assistance team, both working on body-worn cameras within correctional facilities. Now, from the Washington, D.C. Department of Corrections, we have Ben Collins. Ben is the Special Assistant to the Deputy Director of Operations, where among his many duties, I imagine he gets to run the body-worn camera project. And he has been, he began his career actually with the DC Metro Police Department and moved into corrections. For the New Jersey Department of Corrections, we have Alfred Kendall and Michael White. Alfred is the Department of Corrections Director of Operations. He began as a juvenile officer in 1983, and he has worked in several capacities in 6 different correctional facilities. Mike White is a regional manager in the New Jersey Department of Corrections. He began his career in 1997 as a correctional officer, worked his way up to major, and has served as major in 3 different correctional facilities before becoming the regional major. So thank you to both for joining us as well. So for today's session, I have a couple questions that I'm going to direct to several of our panelists and give each of them a chance to answer. Obviously, questions relating to body-worn cameras in correctional agencies and facilities. And then I think we will have some time for questions of our panelists and representatives. So if you're in the audience and you have questions that come up, please feel free to log them in the chat or let one of our facilitators know, and we'll get to them. So let me start with the tough questions first, maybe. I'd like to ask, Ben, I think I'll start with you. What are some common barriers to adopting body-worn cameras in correctional facilities that you've encountered, and how has your agency addressed those?
Some of the more common barriers have been, first of all, the somewhat reluctance of staff. It's been kind of a tough sell, so to speak, but we were able to show the benefit through having a pilot program, which really helped us. Physical structure of our facility was also a barrier for from a technical standpoint. We were able to also work our way through that during the pilot process as well. but mostly the culture and the adapting to the body-worn cameras for staff.
Thanks, Ben. I'm wondering if you might just talk for a second, if you might, about the physical structures and the things that you had to work around as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, our particular, one of our buildings is, we have a linear structure, and that it just wasn't very, it's not Wi-Fi friendly. And there was just some issues in terms of, from a technical standpoint, that we ran into, that we had to get some assistance with. We were able to work our way through that. And that's basically, that was
Okay.
basically.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Ollie, I'm going to go to you next. In the work that you've been doing with correctional facilities, what kind of barriers have you observed in terms of just getting these programs up and running?
Yeah, so I agree. There's certainly some barriers with regards to acceptance or the belief of the need and things like technology. But to be frank, I think the biggest barrier I've seen is the lack of information and the lack of discussion. The lack of community of practice, and and I know that a lot of the good folks that are fighting the good fight are working towards this end. But what happens that I've seen over the last few years is the unfortunate expectation that's placed upon corrections agencies because they're typecast into this role of body cameras for typical police departments. And how that plays out oftentimes is very similar to my home state, New Jersey, where we've had recent legislation passed, and the practitioners, you'll hear them say that these laws they're built for a police department, have little consideration for corrections agencies, but at the same time, they have requirements of these corrections agencies. So, and we all know that folks are well intended, and that evolution is coming. There's change coming, but it can put an agency, and particularly an executive, in a unusual, in a detrimental position to have to address all these things, that are expected of them, by their staff, perhaps by their community, and obviously that's different in a lot of cases. Who is the community for a corrections agency is much different than a typical police department, and even with other government agencies. So these expectations can just sometimes be a little bit unfair. And in the meantime, some of the corrections agencies are forced to try to meet these responsibilities, but also do it in a way that fills the need of what they feel they have to meet to appropriately address the requirements of their jobs.
Thank you very much, Ollie. I'm going to stick on this thread for a minute, if I might. Major White, I want to turn to you and just ask if New Jersey experienced maybe some of the same reluctance for officers to take on the cameras that Ben was talking about, and if so, how was that worked, and how had you work to overcome some of that?
We initially did experience reluctance. We lucked out. The facility we started at has had a lot of various allegations, so the staff there weren't as reluctant as other facilities, because a lot of staff there viewed that, without us even encouraging them, that it could help them. It could show that it's their friend. As long as they're doing what they're supposed to do, the camera is their best friend. A lot of staff think, this isn't how we do things in corrections. I'm going to get in trouble because, this is how we talk in corrections. Well, the old days of corrections are gone. So as the staff see that the cameras help them, as long as they're doing what they're supposed to do, they seem to be embracing the cameras. You have a small number of staff that are just anti-cameras because it's not what they're used to, or they're staff that don't know how to act professionally.
Yeah. Appreciate it, Mike. Al, I'm going to come to you just in case you want to add anything to that. I got a question for you in a minute or two, but you want to add anything to that?
Well, I just want to piggyback off what Ollie said, about the difference between, community policing and corrections. It's almost apples and oranges. Mm-hmm. And that has been, I concur, that has been a significant barrier. And it translates into difficulty with training, implementation, and buy-in from the officers when we don't have our own clear set of guidelines for corrections.
Yeah, appreciate that. Jeff, just for a minute, is there anything you want to add to this conversation about, officer reluctance or barriers that you've seen?
So just real quick, I think it's similar to a little bit of what Ben had talked about and Major White with a little bit of both. So just like over, police agencies and everyone else, depending on who you talk to and the makeup and everything else, some are real excited, some are hesitant. Reoccurring theme though is the exact same with, no one wants to reinvent that wheel. And so when it comes to policy and doing that type of thing with correctional agencies, a lot of them are trying to adopt and do the starting points, and it's very heavily focused police-wise when they're going through all these sample policies, best practices, and all of that type of thing. And Ben brought it up, the director brought it up from New Jersey, Ollie touched on it. It's just one of those that, as this environment with body-worn cameras, and I don't want to say everywhere, but as we're starting to experience them, more than just road patrol, specialized units, tribal, universities, hospital police, all of those, it becomes unique. So as that growth occurs, we're trying to get better policies and things like that so that they have those examples, they have those best practices specifically for their field. And so I know that's been a little bit of a barrier with a lot of the corrections agency, is trying to have that gold standard policy, perhaps, that they can then adopt instead of trying to adopt necessarily from road patrol.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you. My next question has to do with training issues, and I'm going to preface it with a very quick story that might be a common theme here, but I was working at an adult detention facility. And when they introduced cameras there, they basically took the policy and took the training that they gave to their patrol officers and gave it to their correctional officers. So I want to ask, what should training for body-worn cameras in corrections include? And what specifically do correctional officers need in terms of training in your experience? Al, maybe I'll start with you from New Jersey.
Well, our biggest concern is activation and deactivation. And I think that's where we run into the most trouble. Community policing, it's very clear, and they can have an objective set of standards as far as activation, a road stop, a pursuit, entering a dwelling. With correction officers, they're exposed to, quote, the public or the inmate population for their entire shift. They can't be so objective. They have to be more subjective. They have to rely on experience, discretion as to when to activate, when not to activate. And it's very difficult. We had difficulty with our policy development in outlining a specific set of criteria for our correction officers.
Very interesting. I appreciate that. Honestly, I hadn't thought about that perspective up till now. Let me, Major White, anything you want to add to that? Then Ben, I'll come to you if you have anything you want to chime in on training.
Yeah, I believe I agree with everything Mr. Condell said. The hardest part is when to activate, because we don't have those clear-cut standards. I believe the second most important part of training for us is the legal requirements. What are the legal requirements and policies you're obligated to follow in your jurisdiction? And make sure your staff are aware of them. The one thing we discovered that we made a mistake on was once you have what you think is your finished policy, begin the training with a small focus group. Try to issue the cameras to a small number, because we didn't do that. And then we immediately came across numerous instances where we had to clarify or update our policy. Mm-hmm. The biggest thing is in the training, also just make sure the staff know how the cameras can benefit them. Make sure they understand that they're your friend and use them as such. And they were the main instances we had with the training. I mean, the actual physical use of the camera is probably the easiest and most straightforward part of the training.
Yeah. Okay. Reminds me of the crawl, walk, run analogy that I've heard so many times. Appreciate that. Ben, anything you want to add regarding training?
Yes, we initially we had this. I keep bringing it up. We had a 90-day pilot program where our initial pilot program policy was heavily geared towards police incident reactionary type things. And as we went along, we kept that policy very fluid. And I mean, literally each week we were re-examining and restructuring things as we went along to more cater to our needs. We came up with some ways that we could have the officers to make sure that they could cut it on, cut it off. We came up with these live zones, which we call live zones, where they know if they go in a particular live zone, they cut their cameras on immediately once they go in that particular housing unit. And there's very few times when they cut it off. So we've done things like that to make it easier, because we noticed initially when we were doing a lot of incident reactionary, we were missing a lot of things. Just we were having some issues as far as activation. So the training now is it's an 8-hour session. It's a lot of we do a lot of active things, scenarios, things of that nature. So that's where we are.
Thank you very much, sir. Jeff, I'm going to come back to you. Just if there's any other training issues you'd like to highlight based on your experience.
I think a large majority kind of tie back to the activation, deactivation, and trying to train to those guidelines and what they specifically are for each correctional site. But along with that, when you're talking about the actual cameras and the software and the actual upload, download, all of that stuff needs to be included with training. And with corrections, it's often unique. Patrol officers many times, have their own, go back to the station, throw in the dock, or maybe a car. Where corrections agencies, depending on how they're set up, how they're rolled out, depending on the specific, and this can change at the actual site. So New Hampshire Department of Corrections is an example, DC, New Jersey, depending on what building and how it's set up, all of that needs to be included in training too. Who are they going to pass those off to? Who's responsible? And then you have the whole wide variety of the tagging of videos. And it goes back to what I kind of said previously with, their policy and determining who's doing what and how that's going to flow, and not being able to reinvent the wheel while trying to look at what are those magic things that and tags and labels. And then, all of the requirements with whether it's open records, FOIA, state law, all of that to do with the video. So really trying to develop that and train that as part of, Major White made a good point when he talked about having the smaller groups and, whether or not, maybe we're separating those groups out for training and, you're kind of leaving off some of the whole download and tagging procedure because the line officers or even the line supervisors aren't going to be a part of that process necessarily in corrections because they don't have the time or the equipment to actually do that. They're basically just getting issued the cameras and then turning them in at the end of shift.
Appreciate that, Jeff. Thank you. Seems like there's a natural progression to this conversation, so I want to turn to some technology issues next. Ben, I'm going to start with you with a question, then come back to New Jersey. And it occurs to me as I ask this question that I'm actually curious how IT services work in corrections. So how do you get IT support for, when you're trying to install cameras in a correctional facility? But if there are other technical issues, Ben, I think you were referring to them a little bit when you opened up, but any technology challenges that you want to address here, and especially how do you work with IT in corrections? Is that different from law enforcement?
No, our IT department worked with us from the beginning, especially because we had to identify the infrastructure. We're looking at upwards of 1,000 units, so we had to identify. And we are also in several different buildings and locations. So it was, we had to get on board. They had to get on board with us from the very beginning. Just identifying the places for the infrastructure where we will, place this. And the main issue is we are very heavily reliant on the live feeds And that's where the Wi-Fi issues came in, because we do rely heavily with being able to observe things live as they take place. And so that's where our IT department was definitely key.
Al, can you address technology issues from your perspective?
Sure. New Jersey has a pretty substantial IT department, and they were of great help in setting up our system, which is an internet cloud-based system. We did have concerns, bandwidth issues, but our program is still in its infancy. So far the bandwidth hasn't been an issue. Our IT department is going to upgrade our bandwidth, so we don't anticipate any problems. But they were heavily involved in the initial setup, and of great help.
Very good, very good. To you, Major White, do you see any major differences between facilities or facility types in terms of implementing the technology?
I guess the main difference for us would be we don't use Wi-Fi. Nothing is live feed, so everything is recorded and then downloaded later. The biggest questions we faced were whether to go with a cloud-based storage, on-site storage, or a hybrid of the two. We ultimately ended up going with a cloud-based system. I guess the next biggest technological question we had to answer was, how were we going to deploy the cameras? Were they going to be issued to a staff member or rotated throughout the shifts? Mm-hmm. And because of corrections not having patrol cars or cell phones, we ultimately decided we had no choice except to rotate them through the shifts so we could charge them and upload the video at the end of each shift. I mean, that did create another problem of how were we going to assign the cameras? And I guess they were the main technological concerns we had. We lucked out with our bandwidth. We originally were worried about it, but it turns out that our staff are recording much less video than we anticipated. And that was just one thing that we didn't really have a good standard to go by on how much video each staff member would use in corrections, just because there's not that much information out there.
Thank you very much, sir. Ali, I'm going to come to you now. Just generally, what have you observed in your work with correctional facilities on technology issues with body-worn cameras?
So I think the thing I found most compelling has been the evaluation period, right? So the time that an agency has to invest has perhaps been a little bit more significant, and looking for like vendors. So what I've taken from that is back to this community of practice, or the ability to get information about what features are available for a corrections setting, what features are appropriate, so they can kind of get through all the promises kind of a little bit sooner. So I think really the technology of what's available, what's on the market, and what's realistic, and having expertise in that area probably requires more consideration for whether or not you're going to do it locally or outsource it. I know in the case in New Jersey, they're working through a statewide OIT, and so there's potentially for some agencies the ability to collaborate. That may not be there for or the necessity to collaborate where there may not be for most police departments.
Very good. Thank you, Ali. For this next question, I want to turn to probably what we have come to understand as the evidentiary value of body-worn cameras. And so we have learned about and heard about, and there's been some research around the extent to which cameras help with prosecuting cases and providing evidence for cases in court. I know it works differently, and maybe there are some times when there are assaults inside the facility where there's a case filed with the local DA. But I want to ask, how do you see, or have you seen, body-worn cameras impact prosecutorial and defense issues from your perspective in corrections? Let's start with New Jersey again on that one. Al?
Well, we've always, we've had fixed cameras for a while. and we routinely download video, refer it to the prosecutor if something is potentially criminal. But we also have internal evidence gathering for, inmate disciplinary hearings. The body worn camera simply provided another medium, another evidence source for us. And I guess when you're talking about gathering evidence, the great thing about the video is that it helps you prove your case. It helps to enforce your institutional rules, and it helps the prosecutors if anything becomes criminal. So it's just a matter of the more of that we have, the better. With the body cameras, we ran into a little trouble with permissions and who can have access, and when video is restricted, how quickly can the internal administration view the video to determine, to identify victims, to identify assailants. Some of those restrictions have hampered us to some degree, but that all ties into, guidelines that we're forced to adhere to that are more geared toward community policing rather than correctional.
Yeah. Appreciate it. Major, what do you want to add anything to that? And I want to ask specifically, if I might, comparing the value of body-worn camera video to the videos that you get on your stationary cams. Is there an added value there that you see?
Yes, there is definitely an added value there. I mean, not only the obvious factor of having audio, but you can see what's occurring from the officer's perspective. It's not from an eye in the sky perspective where you can see the entire room and not sure what the officer is seeing. The body camera shows what the officer actually saw. How close something was to him, the time frame he had to react to something. So I think there's it has a very large impact as far as prosecutions. We haven't really seen any criminal trials yet where it's used because we just implemented it recently.
Yeah.
However, with internal disciplinary hearings, we could never show before with a fixed camera on what the inmate said. Like an inmate would say, I never threatened that officer. I didn't say that. He said this. Well, now we play the video and it shows not only did the inmate throw something on the officer, the inmate threatened the officer multiple times. Shows that the officer acted professionally. And the biggest thing about that is we've seen already that it has a very large impact in closing investigations for staff misconduct. An inmate would make an allegation that when the officer searched my cell, he destroyed all my property, or he spoke to me in an inappropriate manner. Well, now where it used to be an investigation that would take weeks or a month, now it can be closed out just by watching the video.
Yeah, thank you very much. That is a story that's been told over and over and over again in police agencies and correctional agencies alike. I'm going to come to Ben and just ask, just for clarity, Ben, is that the same experience that you're having in DC? Are the cameras helping close out these cases? Do you see any other evidentiary value with the, from the cameras?
Oh, absolutely. Especially when it comes to the de-escalation efforts, compromise and talk to persons' aggressive behavior. That's really helped us a lot. And then they're even starting now, they're starting to trickle into some of the criminal court matters as well. And it's just invaluable. And I think our officers are finally starting to see the value as it relates to the drop in PREA complaints, the drops in different certain complaints we used to get, allegations and things of that nature. But the cameras have really had an impact on that.
Good. Much appreciated. Jeff, I'm going to come to you with any general thoughts that you have about the evidentiary value that you've observed.
Nothing really more, Chip, other than just to reemphasize everything that we've heard so far. We hear a lot of good information back from sites that have implemented that have helped with civil cases, as Ben mentioned, PREA cases, lawsuits, a few criminal, but a lot of the internal or even civil lawsuits. I'm not going to get into a huge story, but I have a friend who's a sheriff, and he talks about how often he's sued for stuff inside the jail. And, we've talked multiple times that I said, well, you may want to talk to some of these other sites and think about BWCs. Whether he'll do that or not, we'll see. But yeah, we hear about it all the time. But, a lot of it is this whole conversation. It is new in a lot of aspects, or, newer stages. So a lot of that is stuff that we're getting back, that we're being able to share. It'll be really interesting as more and more correctional sites come online. A lot of the data to back that, to help show part of the reward versus cost for implementation.
Yeah, appreciate it. So I have another couple questions that I think I'm going to ask, but Jessica, I think I saw a question come through the chat. Can we turn our attention to that for a few minutes?
I think that'd be great. Would you like me to read it to you?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. So a question came in saying, how did you get around the lack of funding to upgrade physical IT infrastructure in the jails that are concrete and steel?
Okay, so kind of a capital improvement question. Ben, I think since you work more in a jail environment than our friends from New Jersey, you want to take a stab at that?
Well, fortunately, our facility was going through an upgrade anyway, so we were kind of able to piggyback on that somewhat. So, and there was some funding set aside as well, but for the most part, we were already in the process of, doing some of the Wi-Fi and different thing upgrades with the tablet program that we have in our facility.
Okay. New Jersey, did you have funding issues around getting your upgrades done?
Our pilot program's funded via a grant. So the funding wasn't an issue. The OIT costs, our OIT structure, our infrastructure was able to handle it. We use like I said, a cloud-based system. We tapped into our already existing iTag connections or our internet connections. So it just happened to work out well, and we didn't have to do any significant upgrades.
Okay, good. Jessica, are there any other questions that have come in?
So we do have a couple other questions that I could read to you. One of them is, how would you address privacy for searches regarding a medical or juveniles?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let's go to Major White, maybe. How does your policy, or how does your training, how do your officers deal with privacy issues with cameras?
In our department, we do not have any juveniles, so we do not worry about that.
Yeah.
As far as medical, certain privacy concerns are dictated to us by our Attorney General guidelines. And they have, once the video is recorded, such as anything that is a medical or mental health treatment area, it must be restricted. And that's very limited access. That's one of the areas we're having problems with, because according to the guidelines, we can't view that evidence until we get approval from the county prosecutor. And a large number of our videos end up in the hospital. Anything that results in a use of force, the inmate is medically examined, and any of those videos we can't access readily for any reason unless we get approval from the county prosecutor. Mm-hmm. As far as privacy concerns with searches, we do not videotape or use the body cameras on strip searches. That's another area, according to the Attorney General guidelines, we are mandated to video record all searches. We're still waiting for a legal opinion on how that applies to strip searches. In practicality, how we do it is the staff member that's actually doing the strip search removes their body camera, places it in their pocket so that there's no mistaking that it's on or recording. It doesn't agitate the inmate, but another officer will stand off to the side and film the officer that's actually doing the strip search so that you can show that nothing untold happened, but it maintains the inmate's privacy.
Yeah. Delicate situations, interesting. Ben, can you talk for a little bit about how privacy concerns are dealt with at DC?
In Washington, D.C. That's a major issue in the District of Columbia. We obviously cannot and will not, record any strip searches, and so we had to come up with ways around that because now that we've had the body worns, that's where we're starting to get the complaints because inmates know that we deactivate the cameras during the strip search. So we had to get a little bit more creative and just kind of turn out cameras, but keep them on, but not facing the inmates, so we can at least get the vocal audio. So that was our way around that.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to go to Ollie first, and then Jeff. Just in your observations, gentlemen, how are these privacy concerns playing out?
So, from listening to other agencies, I think it's, Major White hit it on the head that they're finding that, I've noticed that folks have tried to do some level of recording, but balancing it with the respect and maintaining of dignity for all folks for some sense of continued justice with their inmates. So I think that's it's a smart way to help document what actually is happening, and then keeping folks informed with some level of accountability. So I think it's great that they're doing that they're looking at it in some way and found some way to document everything that's as much as they can is taking place. I think documenting more is clearly a benefit to agencies to understand what happened in as many situations as possible. So I think that's why I see happening and becoming more common, is that there's more recording taking place to the extent possible.
Okay, how about you, Jeff?
Yeah, starting out, I learned a lot about DC from Ben and the team and some of the uniqueness when comparing to some other of our sites. So that's why I kind of chuckled there when Ben was talking about privacy in DC. It's one of those that, Major White brought it up with, depending on what state they're in, depending on what those state laws are going to be, that they're going to have to follow, it does change things a little bit. And then what we've also seen with different sites is a little bit different philosophy or different policy on how they're handling it. Very interesting listening to him with, the officer who's doing the actual strip search is throwing theirs in a pocket. The other one is recording the officer that's doing the search. One of our sites right now is at least planning on and will be recording strip searches as part of their policy. Sort of what Ben was talking about with, they're worried that if they're deactivating, that's where all of a sudden all of these complaints are going to start flowing in, accusations and things of that nature. Whether or not that'll change after rollout and they start dealing with some of the issues, not real sure. We're finding kind of the lower end right now on the juvenile question with corrections, because a lot of our sites are either doing pilot programs or they're starting out with 3 or 4 maybe units with the intention of going statewide or capacity wide. And either they don't have juveniles or they're doing the implementation. I don't want to say at the easier places first, but that seems to be a question that I think is still not really answered well for a lot of correctional agencies. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate that. I want to go to a question about kind of program management in the correctional settings. And I'm wondering, maybe Al, I'll start with you. How do you kind of distribute oversight and management of the body-worn camera program in corrections? Is it facility by facility? Who's in charge? Who's doing the monitoring and the auditing? Just things like that.
That's kind of ongoing. We're still trying to figure that out. And that's a big piece of it. In the correctional setting, we're deploying we're giving almost the whole shift a camera. So the deployment and the collection and the tagging takes up a lot of resources. We have to, devise mechanisms. We have log sheets to fill out. We have, lines of officers waiting to hand in their cameras who may or may not get an overlap because of the extra time it takes for them to leave their shift. So we're still working that out, and Major White is kind of coordinating all that, and we're changing as we go, similar to our policy.
Yeah.
It's all very fluid at this point.
I hear that. Yes, sir. Benjamin, how fluid is it in Washington, D.C.?
Well, initially during the pilot process, it was very, very fluid. I mean, every week we were just adapting new things, and we had to do it because we learned through trial and error how much different a corrections agency is from a police department. And our initial blueprint was from our family, the DC police family, who we kind of used initially on our blueprint for our pilot, but we soon learned the uniqueness of corrections and the jail versus the police department. So it was very fluid. Our initial policy and the policy we came up with for our final product is totally two different documents, totally different.
Much yet to learn from body-worn cameras and corrections. I can see that. I want to ask a question that's actually come to my mind as we've been talking today. So it's a little bit off the cuff, but please bear with me. And Major White, maybe I'll start with you first. I'm just curious, how does the issue of redaction and requests for opportunities to view or copies of videos impact corrections, if at all? Has that hit you guys yet, Major?
Really, none of those have hit us yet. The biggest, like I said, none of ours have went to criminal trial yet. Some have been shared with the prosecutor. We have not received any OPA request for video yet. The biggest problem we have so far is for us to get permission to view the restricted videos based on the guidelines. That's it. I mean, that's the largest hamper to us, is the guidelines that were placed by the AG, the Attorney General, for privacy concerns and community policing that they rarely encounter. We encounter daily.
Yeah. Okay. Al, do you want to add anything to that before I go to Ben?
I have to concur with what Major White said. We really haven't gotten there yet, but it is outlined in the Attorney General guidelines in regards to redaction and release of the video. But luckily we haven't gotten there yet, but that is going to be a hurdle. We are going to need legal clarification. It could be similar to our current OPA requests that we receive, but we don't know the criteria by which we would release or not release.
Yeah. Okay. Ben, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, we have currently, I guess, about 900 fixed cameras on our primary facility. And so we do a lot of interaction with the U.S. Attorney's Office, who is our local prosecutors, which is also another unique situation. So there's a lot of redaction, there's a lot of editing that goes on with those cameras because they're 24-hour, they run 24 hours. So you would have certain time frames of video footage to provide. So we use that as the basic backdrop for how we would treat the body-worn camera footage as well, because there are some housing units in our facility where the body-worns will be going almost the whole shift. So obviously, for certain situations, adjustment board hearings or other things, those cameras are going to be edited through certain time parameters, just as we do with the fixed cameras. So we kind of use that as our guidelines and follow that same protocol, and we haven't had any issues with that. Appreciate
that, sir. I'm Ollie or Jeff, anything you want to add to this conversation? I'm going to go to a closing question in a minute. I'll start with you, Ollie.
So I think, because the nature of of most of their complaints are probably administrative, it is much less of a conversation. But it's one that I think that it's worth consideration because a lot of police departments have successfully taken that work and gotten a great deal of assistance from prosecutors and district attorneys. So to the extent that those collaborations can take place, I think there's opportunity there for some agencies to look and see, where can you partner to not necessarily pass off redaction, but if it's being prepared for court, or if there's some type of work that could be done, and you can lessen your burden, then I think there's opportunity for corrections agencies to take advantage of that.
Thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, just real quick, I kind of want to combine what Ben said and Al. What we're hearing from a lot also just goes back to, number one, kind of learning to see what the guidelines from that state's going to be on release, because it seems to be kind of in between, where a lot are relying on, as Ben had said, what their prior has been with the CCTV, fixed cameras, whatever you want to call them. Because with corrections, a lot of times they have, I don't want to call it protection, but more privacy and don't have to release as often, depending on the state. So it's kind of that hybrid between those two thoughts of, what have we been doing? What does that look like? That's probably how it's going to be mostly for BWC footage. And also, well, maybe not so much depending on what state guidelines are going to be, but no one's really tested those waters. So we're going to have to wait and see.
Okay. I'm going to go into just a final question. I'll go from Ben to Al to Major, but before I do that, let me just thank each of you again sincerely for your participation in this session today. As I said, I think there's an awful lot to be learned from corrections, and I think our work is kind of cut out for us, and so I appreciate each of you for stepping up for this session today. But Ben, just an open question: what else would you like your colleagues in corrections to know about implementing body-worn camera programs as we move into the future?
I would suggest that you, if you can, have a pilot program, at least 90 days, or even more, and make it very controllable. It doesn't have to be anything large. Make it something that you can really control. It could be small. Select one housing unit, select your tactical team, somebody like that, and just monitor it and make your adjustments as you go along to fit your uniqueness. But I would always suggest doing a pilot program if you can do it, because that's where you're going to really work out a lot of the issues that you'll eventually have to deal with if you don't.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Al, how about you?
I would just say, understand, don't try and fit a square peg in a round hole. Understand the correctional environment. Rely on your correctional experts in developing a policy, and develop a reasonable, concise, efficient policy based on the correctional environment and based on correctional experts.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Major White?
I would just say that two most important things I've learned since doing this that I wish I knew was, one, before you begin your policy development, make sure have legal interpretations of all the laws and guidelines you're obligated to follow. For us, we had our policy completed, and then a new law came out and the guidelines came out. So therefore, we had to go back and reinvent our policy without having clear legal understanding of how it applies to corrections. The second biggest thing I've learned is, if you plan on issuing and retrieving your cameras at the beginning of end of each shift, if you're doing any high number of cameras, spend the money and purchase mounts to issue to your staff. It actually takes much more time to issue and retrieve the mounts than it does the cameras. So they are well worth the money. Just buy them and issue them.
Words from the wise. Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. So we are actually at the end of the session right now. Again, just let me offer my thanks to each of you for responding to our request to participate in this and for joining us today. Jessica, do I hand it back to you for our marching orders?
Yes, thank you so much. And again, thank you all for the presenters for such a wonderful session. As you can tell, there's a plethora of information, and we just are really excited to dive deeper into this topic. Rena, I did see a question come in from you, and so I'll make sure that our panelists do get with you after to answer that question.